Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on AI in the workplace. I'm joined by my colleague, Rob Smedley. A couple of things before we start. The first thing is, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but today will not be an AI magic show. It is very tempting, but I've managed to resist the temptation to compose a whole webinar in rhyming couplets or do anything funky like that. This will not be an AI magic show. We all know that AI can do weird and wonderful things. We're going to concentrate on the very technical things that it can do within the HR world. As Tom mentioned at the outset, if you do have any questions as we go along, if you pop those into the Q&A function, then we will try and pick those up at the end. Hopefully we will have time to deal with those. And if we don't have time to deal with them within the webinar, then we will try to respond to them separately. If you pop to the content slide, please, Tom, just a summary of what we're going to be looking at today. So I'm going to take you through the common features of AI where we're seeing an impact in the HR space. Rob's then going to have a look at the potential impact of AI on jobs and what we should be thinking about strategically in that area. I'm going to talk about managing the risks inherent in using AI. And then finally, Rob's going to deal with your homework for today in terms of workplace policies. So if you could pop onto the next slide, please, Tom. Okay, so one of the main areas where we have seen and are seeing the impact of AI in the HR sphere, as many of you will know, is within recruitment. AI has the potential to significantly streamline and make more efficient the recruitment process. And I've mentioned on this slide ways in which it is being used. So at the very outset, in terms of job adverts, is designing those job adverts, creating content for job adverts using AI. Then we look at screening candidates, CV screening and shortlisting, again, can be done by AI. Interviews and candidate interactions done by chatbots or video interviews, and then also selection, matching people's skills, answers to criteria, answers to interview questions. So AI has the potential to make the recruitment process cheaper, save money, and potentially make it more effective, and potentially create better and fairer results. I don't think anyone is suggesting that employers are going to start recruiting their CEOs by AI. What we're talking about here is large-scale recruitment exercises where you're recruiting hundreds of drivers a year or thousands of people in call centers a year, where there can be significant efficiencies gained by the use of AI. What we're seeing is what I've referred to on the slide as some tech wars, because there are two sides to this fence. On the one hand, we have employers seeking to use AI, but on the other hand, we have candidates using AI. And interestingly, there was an article in the FT fairly recently about this, saying that whilst AI is potentially creating efficiencies for the recruitment process for employers, what it is also meaning is that candidates are able to make more job applications, because the time needed to tailor CVs to particular jobs or to answer questions, make applications, etc., is being reduced where candidates are using AI. So it's interesting to see where that balance lies, and whether in fact, when I talk about AI making recruitment more efficient, whether that will in fact be the case, because whilst we might be able to deal with more applications quickly, the fact is we will get even more applications than we did before. So it might even itself out. Just an example of another thing that someone mentioned to me is candidates gaming the system where AI is used, particularly in CV screening. And an example of that being candidates setting out their CV in the normal way, then underneath it, copying and pasting the job description or person specification, then changing the job description or person specification into white text. And what that means is If a human is looking at that CV, they can't see it, they just see a blank page. If a computer or AI is looking at that CV and is screening the document to match words within the CV to the job description, it does see those words. And you're the perfect match to the job description because the job description is within your CV. So systems are having to spot those ways of gaming the system, and there will be many more, and work that in and avoid people being able to work around the technology. The other issue to flag about use of AI within recruitment is the danger, and this has been highlighted. There was a study done by Delacqua at the Harvard Business School. There is a danger of over-reliance on AI in the same way that we can all sympathize with use of sat-nav, for example. We all get over-reliant on it and lazy. And they did a study where they gave recruiters different types of AI, some good, some bad, some moderate. And what they found was, in terms of recruiting the best candidates, the candidates that objectively better fitted the bill in this exercise, it was the recruiters who had the worse AI that did the better job. Because AI carried out an initial exercise for them, but they recognized that it was imperfect and that there had to be an element of human interaction. The ones who had the best form of AI just relied on that and got lazy and failed to spot things. And so there is this risk of over-reliance within AI that we need to be mindful of. Next slide, please, Tom. Okay. Hot off the press. So hot off the press that I've had to pretend to hastily draw up a slide on this. Some of you may have seen last week the Information Commissioner's Office published some guidance on use of AI within recruitment. So for those of you out there who are either using it or thinking of using it, this is an important document. What they did is they carried out a voluntary audit of developers of AI recruitment tools. They produced a significant report, a multi-page report that has over 300 recommendations within it. But the summary of that report is effectively saying to employers who are using AI within recruitment, because of the nature of the beast is there will be lots of personal data involved there. The ICO, the Information Commissioner's officers, are interested in this and are putting guidance in place for employers to say, look, you need to think about the data implications of this exercise. And you need to ask yourself 6 key questions. The first question is, have you completed a data protection impact assessment, which shall ideally be carried out at the procurement stage? And we'll mention DPIs later as well. Secondly, have you identified what your lawful basis is for processing personal data? Now, without going into all of the GDPR rules, essentially, where you're processing personal data, you need a lawful basis for that. And forms of sensitive special category data, such as race, ethnic origin, health data, require additional specific conditions to be met. So you need, before you're entering into an exercise where you're going to be processing personal data, you need to identify what your lawful basis is for that. 3, have you documented the responsibilities? Is it clear which of the employer or the platform is the controller of the personal data? And if the platform is the controller of the personal data, is there an appropriate contract in place with the provider that is clear about data protection responsibilities? Next, have you checked that the provider has mitigated bias? So, as well as from a discrimination law point of view, and we'll get to that later, from a data protection point of view, personal information must be processed fairly. And tools that have inbuilt bias, or an example given by the ICO, a tool that enabled recruiters to filter out candidates with particular protected characteristics, will be an unfair processing of data, so will be a data breach as well as potentially a discrimination claim. Transparency is a key issue from a data perspective and from an employment law perspective, and we'll discuss that later, but they talk about, is the AI tool being used transparently? And the last question, you need to think about how you will limit unnecessary processing. General principles of data law are that data should only be processed for the lawful basis that you've outlined, and there shouldn't be sort of tangential use of that data. And again, this is personal information is going to be stored within these systems in a way that it might not be in your current recruitment systems. And unnecessary processing might also include things like, is that data being used to train the AI model that the provider is developing? If it is that lawful? Have people been told that is how their data are being used? So I do recommend the ICO's recent guidance on this. Next slide, please. The other recommended reading, it is not a page turner, but it is a really useful document for anyone looking at moving into this sphere, is recent government guidance on responsible recruitment in AI. It's 49 pages long, and really it's essential reading, I think, for anyone looking at going down this path. And broadly speaking, splits the use of AI within recruitment into 3 sections: before procurement, during procurement, and before deployment. So before procurement, what it says is employers have to have a clear vision that outlines the desired purpose of the AI system. What problem are they trying to solve? How can using AI help? Is AI appropriate for this problem? Okay, so what is the purpose? Then look at functionality. What outcomes do I want? Is AI capable of providing these outcomes to me? Resources and governance, things like how will the system integrate with existing processes and interact with employees? It recommends consulting with employees who will use the system and identifying what training they will need. As I mentioned on the previous slide, the Delacqua study, the indications are at this early stage, the best outcomes come where there is a combination of AI and human oversight, human input. It would be not recommended to simply put in place an AI system and then have to catch up on training afterwards. You have an inefficient system there. So be thinking even before the procurement stage, what training resources will be needed in order to implement this system. Applicant accessibility is a theme throughout the process and is a really important one. And there is a particular issue about considering applicants with disabilities. And does the introduction of technology into the recruitment process create new barriers to those with particular protected characteristics? Does it amplify existing risks and biases? And I'll come back later after Rob's spoken on the risks and the scale of these risks here. But this is something to be considered before procurement. Data protection impact assessment comes up again, and an equality impact assessment. Public sector organisations have an obligation to do this anyway, but it is recommended that all private sector organisations also carry out an equality impact assessment. So not just dealing with applicant accessibility, but all elements of the recruitment process and assessing whether there are potential equality issues that might be triggered. So things like video interviews that rely on judging body language, eye contact, voice recognition, does that present an equality risk for some people with some protected characteristics? Going back to the use of AI in terms of designing adverts, targeted advertising. If you're using targeted advertising, are there equality risks there in terms of who you're targeting and, more importantly, who you're excluding? So those are all things to think about before procurement. During procurement, when you've identified all of those issues and when you've got a potential provider, effectively, in lay person's terms, what the government are saying here is you need to look under the bonnet of the model that you are being sold. So you need to scrutinize the system and its accuracy. And if it hasn't been made clear to you, be asking questions around what type of AI is being used, what data has been used to train the model, what is the demonstrated accuracy and performance of the model across different groups and across groups with different protected characteristics, and what are the identified risks and limitations. And those should be set out, last point there, in the model card, which is a standardized form of reporting tool for capturing key facts about AI models. And it should set out, as well as the benefits of the model, the limitations of the model. And this is important so that employers are aware so that they can adjust their processes accordingly. The example given in the guidance is a model card that says, this includes interview transcription. So we have video interviews, interviews are transcribed. However, we, the developer, know that our transcription of applicants who speak Spanish and Portuguese is not as good as other languages. It's not a problem it's not a problem we've been managed to solve yet. So we admit there is a deficiency in that product, and therefore there might be a workaround for that in terms of manual transcription of those interviews. So that really is where the government are emphasising, where we as lawyers would emphasise. Beware the AI product that claims it's perfect, because none of them at this stage are perfect, and they should admit those imperfections so that you're aware of them and so that you can deal with the potential risks. Another risk identified is where you carry out a bias audit and it identifies that however people are being recruited, there is a risk of bias against people with disabilities or people who are neurodiverse. And again, in those circumstances, that's not necessarily to say you can't use the system, but it might be that for those individuals, they won't be scored using the automated screening system, and they will be scored in the traditional way and compared with others. Before deployment, it talks about ensuring correct usage. So again, training employees in how to use it, and also a constant system of assessing and training. So assessing the model performance against the quality outcomes that you need. You will have been given at the outset suppliers' test data, but once it is up and running, then you should be able to assess the performance and constantly assess it on a regular basis. And are any issues arising? Are we spotting a reduced number of successful applicants with a particular protected characteristic? Because that would be a red flag that there is some inbuilt bias that we haven't spotted at an earlier stage. So that's the government guidance. I would recommend, A, if you're looking at introducing this, that you read it. B, if you want to get ahead of the game on this, and as an individual, be ready for the AI and HR world that Rob will talk about, it is a good opportunity to appraise yourselves of the various issues involved. Next slide, please, Tom. In addition to recruitment, the other area that we've seen a lot of movement is performance monitoring, and things like tracking productivity. Might not be very sophisticated AI that does that, but any computer, any automated process to track productivity is what we're talking about here. The other more sophisticated way that some employers are looking at using it, I know that Google use it for this, is predictive analytics for identifying high performers and progression. So the monitoring of work, rather than in the old days just looking down the list of sales figures and, well, these are our best salespeople, so these are the ones who will promote. AI and technology does enable employers to take a more holistic approach to that performance monitoring. More things can be tracked, not only the volume of emails sent, but the tone of emails, the success of emails. All of those sorts of things can, in theory, be tracked to look at who are our high potential performers, trying to create a more high performing workforce. Number of things to think about here. First one is transparency, that if technology is being used, employees need to know about that. Second thing, again, make no apology for repeating it, but as with any technology, the importance of equality impact assessments and data protection impact assessments. And the third thing to think about, the issue of workplace culture, and that whilst it might, in theory, create a more efficient workplace, are you going to dissuade candidates or discourage employees? Are they going to say, I don't want to be monitored by a robot or monitored in my home? There is an element of tech wars here as well. Some of you may have seen one of the big banks in America recently generated some publicity. They'd got lots of employees working from home. They were using software that identified whether or not people were active on the systems, with a view to identifying those people who were just sitting at home watching telly, not doing much work. Employees gamed the system by using what I think was referred to as mouse jiggling software. So it was particular software that every so often would move the cursor around on your screen. So whilst you were watching morning telly in the living room, this software would give the impression that you were doing work, and those employees were discovered. But again, another example of the fact that the tech exists on both sides of the fence here. It's not just employers. In addition to performance monitoring, there are lots of other ways where AI has the potential, might not quite be there yet, but has the potential to impact on the HR sphere. And these are things certainly to have on our radar and to be looking at. So one is personalized training programs. So a good example would be this webinar. So at the moment, I've prepared this webinar for 500 people who've signed up, and I've had to assume some level of knowledge. It's done on a fairly generic basis because I don't know each individual attendee. The time may come where actually I could produce a generic webinar. You could input your personal preferences, exactly what you want to get out of this, and AI would produce 500 individualized webinars. Increasing employee engagement is another example. If you do an annual staff survey, for example, at the moment, if a human creates that survey and a human analyzes the results, that could instead be done by AI and could be done, therefore, more cheaply, more efficiently, and potentially more regularly. Workforce planning, in terms of creating optimal structures, we've seen some movement in that sphere. And the final example I'll just give you before passing on to Rob is that of training staff and, for example, sales training. At the moment, How many one-to-ones do we have with sales staff? If we do have them, it's a human critiquing another human's sales style, or listening to their calls and giving them feedback on that. If AI can do that and pick up on body language, tone, language used, etc., upskilling people without having to use human resource to do that, again, potentially creates efficiencies if being dealt with at scale. All of that could have a potential impact on jobs. So I think Rob's now going to talk about some studies done in relation to where those impacts might be and where we might want to be going strategically.
Thanks, Matt. So next slide, please, Tom. Thanks. Yeah, so we've all seen and hear on a constant basis commentary, research, reports about the practical impact of AI on essentially on the job market. Some super pessimistic, some super optimistic, and lots kind of in between. One report we've chosen to kind of focus on is a policy report produced early this year from the Institute for Public Policy Research, which was extensive, looking not only in the UK but beyond, and that produced some really interesting findings and insight. I mean, the first point for context here is, history shows we've been through this process before. There have been technological advancements, there have been technological and industrial revolutions. But the kind of key headline, I suppose, that was backed up by this report is the pace of change. So again, for context, 60% of jobs in the US today did not exist in 1940. But when these revolutions happen in terms of advancement, certain jobs fall away, new jobs are created, people find their way into new roles, new jobs as things change. But that's the headline. That's one of the key points. It is the pace. So if we think again about history and what that shows, the kind of industrial revolutions, steam engines, etc., the whole impact in that area took over 120 years. So opportunity was there for things to phase in, phase out. The advent of electricity and the rollout of that advancement was 60 years in the making. So again, that opportunity is there for certain jobs and roles to fall away and others to be created and replaced. The issue, I think, as we all clearly see and backed up by this report, is that generative AI is just moving so quickly. So those kind of fundamental changes and advancements are taking place, in the space of a few years, if not sometimes in the space of a few months. And therefore, the opportunity for new jobs and new careers to be created is perhaps under some pressure. The research, the IPPR research showed from their findings, that the main roles or top 5 roles which may be most exposed to generative AI advancement, personal assistant type roles, secretarial roles, etc., HR administrative roles, research type positions, marketing professionals, authors, writers, translators. Some of those perhaps of no great surprise, but that's what the IPPR research showed. As stated, it's all about the movement into new roles and opportunities, and that's where the IPPR's main concern still lies, is that if we don't have that balanced change, that overall it could potentially drag down overall consumption and GDP. So history has said that automation brings down the price of goods, which means people have more income to spend on other things, which creates demand for other products, which in turn creates new jobs. But there are 3 reasons from the IPPR in particular that they believe this may not apply to the AI revolution or situation. So again, there's that point around the timing of it, that in the past, these advancements have taken more time and there's been that opportunity for change. There's also history shows situations where advancements impact certain sectors of society disproportionately. So an example is where there was automation of the textile production sector, and how that had a massive impact on the proportion of women in the labour market for that particular period of time. And there's a concern again that the impact of AI will impact certain sector type roles and areas of the workforce in such a way again. And the third point relates to job transitions in this way as a result of advancement are dependent upon the employee skills available for those new roles and opportunities. And the IPPR highlighted a concern around whether those employee skills will be ready and available as we move into next phase, into new roles and opportunities. So one proposal they refer to is the industrial strategy for social occupations. So in other words, an emphasis on certain types of people-based, people-skilled roles, for example, in education, across the board in terms of education professionals, health professionals, social workers, sports and well-being support roles, mental health, nursing and similar. So a real focus on those types of specific people-based roles. And from a task or skills perspective, thinking strategically about roles where there's an emphasis on interpersonal relationships and trust, ethical sensitivities and moral judgments, creative originality, high stakes decision making, and complex problem solving in dynamic environments. Next slide, please, Tom. And again, research and the IPPR findings in terms of how that kind of flows through to practical impacts in the HR world. So as roles disappear, this may, of course, mean redundancy scenarios, and there will be a real emphasis for organisation and HR support to consider the fairness of those redundancy processes, even more so if individuals, for example, admin, if we take an admin type support role, the availability of alternative admin support roles will decline. So, an even greater emphasis to get the redundancy process right in the first place, because alternatives will be fewer for that type of work. Training, I mean, some important questions for organizations to be asking now in relation to generative AI and how it can be used within the organization for current roles to generate efficiency. Are you as an organization involved in projects or initiatives in that space for your existing workforce? And also trying to, again, be strategic and think ahead. So in terms of where roles may exist in 5 years' time, for example, are there opportunities to train and upskill existing workforce to move and transition into those roles, within the next few years, rather than wait and try and react in 5 years' time. So trying to think about current and future from a training perspective. There's also consideration in relation to talent attraction, and again, a bit of a hot topic at the moment, because basically previous automation situations and thinking was all around advancements would mean we'd all spend less time working, we'd all have more free time away from work. But what reality showed was that even though those efficiencies were introduced, we just ended up producing more and more. So our working time did not decline as a result of the advancements. And so what IPPR and others speak about is, well, actually, is there the potential to draw a line in the sand in relation to productivity and volume, so that actually, yes, there may be opportunity to have less work time. And at the moment, I think we've seen in the press certain government departments, or the possibility for certain government workers trying to push for the 4-day working week. And this may be a real area of analysis and discussion within organisations around. It's not necessarily about using higher salary or other benefits to attract individuals. It's actually the real focus on the working time and essentially the advent of the 4-day working week as a result. Next slide, please, Tom.
I think that's back to me.
It is.
Thanks very much, Rob. So this section is, believe me, not designed to scare you away from using AI, but it is important to acknowledge these risks and the reason why it may appear scary and why there is potentially some hesitancy in embracing AI is because of the scale of the risks. In that, if you are using AI to carry out recruitment exercise, the example I gave earlier, you recruit hundreds of drivers a year and you use it for 3 years, and it then transpires that there was an inherent bias within that program, you are potentially exposed to lots of discrimination claims from lots of people who have been through that process. So in terms of the scale of risk, it is, I've seen some mention saying, look, will AI related claims be the new equal pay claims, i.e. claims at scale that cost lots and lots of money? And there is certainly the potential for that, because we're not talking about individual decisions here. We're talking about systemic decisions. In the very early days of AI, there was a cautionary tale from a large global employer that wanted to use AI to screen candidates. So it's plugged into the model all its CVs from successful people. So it said, these are people who we have recruited. These are their CVs. We want to recruit people like this. So please, will you screen all applications on that basis? That will streamline the process because we're more likely to get successful people. What the AI and the algorithm determined was it looked at the CVs from successful candidates and it noted that, whatever it was, 75% of the CVs that it had been provided from successful candidates had male names. So it therefore thinks, okay, male name equals successful candidate. Therefore, where I'm screening all these CVs, I discount all female names, which of course leads to potential large-scale discrimination claims. Now, we're a bit more sophisticated than that now, and I hope providers are a bit more sophisticated, but that's just to demonstrate the potential issue and the potential risks. And so we repeat this point about regular audits of the data, and providers should also be doing this to ensure that there aren't biases inherent in the algorithms that you as the end user are inheriting. And we repeat the point again around transparency, that people know what systems are being used. Second issue to mention in terms of dealing with managing AI risks is the issue around evidence of decision making and accountability. So at the moment, if you face a discrimination claim in the employment tribunal from a candidate who says, I applied for a job, I wasn't recruited, I think it's because I'm female or because of my age or because of my disability or because of my race, whatever it was, at the tribunal, there will be a human witness that says, that wasn't the case, this is what happened. This was your CV, this was your interview, this was how you performed on assessment day, you were marked against this criteria, those were your marks, and therefore this was recruitment done on its merits. Therefore, there was no discrimination. Where decisions aren't being taken by humans, who gives the evidence as to what the decision was? And who can explain how the technology came to the decision that it did? Because what it will require is, going back to that government guidance that I studied at the outset, it would probably require someone saying, look, when we implemented the system, these were the checks we carried out into the system. This was how we programmed it. This was the data that it had. This was how it used the data. But to a certain extent, it's self-learning. So it's still difficult, if not impossible, for someone to be explaining exactly how the computer reached the decision. And it'll be interesting to see how tribunals deal with that. Because at the moment, the burden of proof, once an employee has established that on the face of it, a decision looks discriminatory, the burden shifts to the employer to show that there was no discrimination. So we emphasize again the importance of an element of human oversight, but even with an element of human oversight, those risks are there. Having spoken about the risks, flip side of that, in theory, technology using algorithms free from bias, in theory, does enable a meritocracy where candidates aren't subject to the unconscious bias of recruiters. And that might be unconscious bias because a lot of you will have seen that studies done by people making job applications, same job application in two different names, whether that is female against male, whether it is a more ethnically diverse name against a traditional name, and studies show that there is unconscious bias there from recruiters. Same candidate, same application, two different names, different results. In theory, AI could develop and technology could develop to be blind to those issues. So it has that huge benefit, but the risks need to be managed, particularly at this early stage, because of the potential scale of exposure. In terms of managing other risks within the workforce, Rob's going to touch on what I referred to earlier as your homework and policies that it might be worth you looking to have in place if you don't already have them in place.
Thanks, Matt. Next slide. Thank you, Tom. Yeah, so practical takeaways and some potential areas for homework, workplace policies. I mean, if we look and think about HR policies themselves, you know, as organizations, where are you at in terms of, do you have standalone AI policies or code of practice, or at least are you looking and incorporating AI issues and considerations into existing policies, such as performance management, recruitment, etc., which Matt has touched upon. So again, there's some overlap here with some of what Matt was discussing, but very much around informing employees and recruits as to where AI is used, when it's used, why, what principles apply, etc., to meet those legal requirements, including data privacy obligations, and making sure, yeah, that is almost a constant review, I guess, at the moment, just because again of the pace of change. So this is all about how the employer is managing employees, how the employer is making decisions. If we look at the middle section about use policies, this is more with a focus on how AI is being used by your existing workforce. So what guidance, support, training, and requirements are in place in respect of your own staff and their use of AI? Because again, the pace of change, we hear all the time about organizations who become very enthusiastic and excited about releasing AI tools into their workforce, but perhaps without full consideration about the risks involved. So hence the need for these use policies to be put in place. The example, an example within our profession is about, using an AI tool to draft a response to a particular legal letter where, Matt or I might upload a client letter into AI, looking for a kind of start on a draft response. And as soon as we release that client data into ChatGPT or whichever tool we're using, we're obviously relinquishing control. We may be in breach of client confidentiality. We may be in breach of data privacy requirements. We may be in breach of professional rules by doing that exercise, and also releasing our client data into that tool. The tool itself could then use that data in terms of other exercises with other organizations and people seeking to do the same. So that kind of control or support to employees as to how they use AI and policies in that space is really important. And then the third area is governance. So again, as things move quickly, who within your organization holds responsibility, accountability for AI issues and tools essentially, and policy. Does that rest with an individual? Does there need to be a committee? Who does it sit with in terms of looking to the organizational requirements, the legal requirements, standards, and so on? Again, from a legal regulatory perspective, it's a fast-moving area, and so who holds responsibility in your organization for keeping track of what's happening and making sure we are policing things correctly within the organization? I think that could be the final one, Tom. I think.
So I think we've just got time to deal with a few questions. Just picking up a few questions on risk and risk management. A question around insuring against the risk of claims and claims at scale. So yes, I could see that. So if you're buying a product, for want of a better term, and that product turns out to be deficient, resulting in you suffering discrimination claims from unsuccessful candidates, can you insure against that risk, or can you claim against the product provider? And I suppose the difficulty there applies in that not all of these products are necessarily completely off the shelf products that are not then touched by the employer. The employer will be involved in inputting its outputs, what it wants to get out of it. If bias does develop within an algorithm, and that can happen, it may not be there at the start, can develop in the algorithm, who is responsible when that happens? So I think there is scope for that to be covered within the commercial terms, and it's an important part of that government guidance on responsible recruitment in AI and apportioning the risk there. Whether it can be insured as a standalone risk, I don't know. That will probably be insured at some stage you take on risk, but it is a significant risk. I don't know specifically what the market is like for that, but there may well become a market for that. Another question around regulation and whether these products are regulated, whether there will come to be sort of regulated standards. And Rob's already mentioned the pace of change and the struggle that legislators are having, in my view, with keeping up with the pace of change. I know there's the EU Artificial Intelligence Act, there's or regulations, there's talk about governance here, but the wheels of governance and government move much slower than the wheels of technology, and catching up with the technology can be quite difficult. And at the moment, my perception is it is a sort of tech version of the Wild West at the moment, in that it isn't heavily regulated. And there is a big debate about the extent to which AI should be regulated. Some of you may have seen a few years ago, there was someone suggesting we should have a moratorium and Gen AI developers should all agree to stop. for 12 months before it got out of hand, and to enable us to think about where this was all going and what future was. This much bigger than employment law, just a general question about the development of humanity. But that hasn't happened. I think it's unlikely to happen. So that there will be some regulatory standards, I'm pretty sure, and there will be increased regulation in this area. But for employers seeking to save costs now and get ahead of the game now, perfectly legitimately, as I say, there are lots of benefits to AI in terms of recruitment, performance management, employee engagement. There are lots of potential benefits to it, and you could fall behind your competitors if you say, well, we're going to wait 5 years until we've got regulations, until we know exactly what we're buying is the gold standard and is perfect. There is a risk out, as Rob outlined, in terms of the efficiency that people could fall behind in that. So it's a really difficult area, I think, for employers now, deciding whether to dip a toe in, whether to dip a leg in, whether to dive in completely to it. For those thinking about it and thinking about it in the recruitment context, again, at the risk of repeating myself, I do recommend the government's guide to responsible recruitment in this area, if only to stimulate some thoughts for you and things that you might want to think about and flag up at a higher level as the potential here. I think that covers the questions. If there's nothing else, then we will finish a few minutes early. And for those of you who've had snow, you can go into the garden or the courtyard at work or wherever it may be and spend 5 minutes playing in the snow. Thank you very much, everyone.